Hello everyone and welcome back to my Magic the Gathering Commander Deck List Reviews. So this is a series where I go through either my own personal Commander decks or those of my users and break them down to their core mechanics. I'll talk about the Commander, what the deck is generally trying to do, give my critiques, and wrap it all up with my thoughts at the end. If you want to get your own deck list reviewed, make sure to head to the top link in the description to get your deck personally reviewed by me. With all that out of the way, let's get into today's episode. So today we are talking about one of the other pre-con commanders from Edge of Eternities. We got two this time. We talked about Hearthhole in the last one, and in this one, we're going to be talking about Kylo Apogee Mind. So Kylo's a very interesting one, mostly because of the archetype, and it's very similar to Hearthhole in how Hearthhole was a Jund Sacklands Matter deck, which is something that we've seen before, but is not quite as in the color pie. You know, using red as a lands matter color is more on the niche side, so getting to use that as sort of our three colors and archetype gives us a little bit of extra and interesting cards to work with. Same thing with Kylo here. So we are a Jeskai proliferate deck. So Kylo here, of course, is Jeskai colors. Robot Artificer 3/3 with haste, and whenever Kylo becomes tapped, proliferate. So, of course, our whole thing here, the great thing with this is, you know, it fuels itself. You know, having haste, it can immediately attack the same turn it comes down to proliferate, though this deck is definitely more based on being able to tap and untap Kylo a bunch of times. And of course, there are infinite combos, as there are with any sort of tapping, untapping effects, a lot of things you can do with that. We're not running any crazy stuff in here that would be like turbo. I would say this is still mostly a bracket 3 deck. And we've got our 3 game changers, though there are some 3-card combos you can throw in here to sort of get that rolling. But they're kind of hard to put together, so it's not like a crazy synergistic combo in terms of being able to, you know, tutor everything out and get it out fast. Like, we're not super built around the combos. They're more of just pieces that, when put together, are already good in our deck, but then, you know, become an infinite combo that can win you the game. So normally, like I said with Hearthhole, you know, we are in a little bit different colors from Proliferate. Usually Proliferate, especially, you know, the more advanced and more, I would say, powerful versions of Proliferate, where it's poison based, are usually green and black, because that's where you get all of the infect. So getting to play Jeskai with Proliferate instead gives us a very different sort of deck to play around. And there's a lot of ways you can build this. I mean, you could just straight up build this Super Friends, like, you know, Atraxa builds are, that can just proliferate to do that sort of thing. This is definitely more built around, because it's, you know, it's a robot, it's an artifact creature. We're built around charge counters, because that was another big thing that came out with Edge of Eternities, was all of the spacecrafts having station where they put charge counters on each other, and, you know, that sort of thing. You know, and I like that WotC's been doing that recently, with being like, okay, here's some older mechanics that maybe aren't as good anymore, didn't get a whole lot of support back in the day, maybe they were for like 1 block or whatever. Let's bring those back and try to you know, increase their power a little bit. And so with this set, we get the charge counter stuff, which I think is really cool. So there's a lot of different things, a lot of different synergy pieces, you know, and +1/+1 counters is another big deal with what we're doing here, but definitely kind of centered around putting counters on stuff and making sure we get a lot of value off of that. So board wipes, kind of pretty standard stuff. We do get to random damning verdict, you know, destroy all creatures with no counters on them, which a lot of our creatures are going to just innately have counters on them. You know, that's another thing you can definitely do with a deck like this, is like modular, where you can, you know, put counters on things, have them move the counters around. I think this is also a good modular build. We haven't really had, I think we got the one bug from Modern Horizons 2 as a sort of modular commander, though again, not super strong. You know, modular isn't a super well supported mechanic. You know, it's one of those that just didn't get enough cards to really have that support, though I think this in a way can have that as at least a sub archetype within it. So having something like Damning Verdict is cool, because a lot of times it can be that one-sided board wipe. You know, was very expensive until it got the reprint in the Final Fantasy pre-con, so that's cool. It's another sort of more budget one to try to pick up in terms of, you know, a board wipe. And then Organic Extinction, so this one's nice. Of course, we want a whole lot of ways within the deck to tap Kylo through, you know, a bunch of different means. One of them being improvise, so we can tap, you know, artifacts to help pay for the mana cost of this spell and destroys all non-artifact creatures. So not only is it something we can, you know, maybe get down to 2 white mana if we have enough artifacts, but even if you're paying 4 or 5 mana like a normal board wipe with a little bit of reduction, you're still getting that some sort of one-sidedness, because almost all of our creatures are going to be artifact creatures, because that's the sort of deck we're going with. So, you know, kind of the normal stuff you could run, you know, if you wanted to spell on your game changer slots, if you're keeping this bracket 3 on a Cyclonic Rift, or, you know, we have access to a lot of the good board wipes in Jeskai, you know, Blasphemous Act, whatever. Farewell is another good one. I don't like Farewell as much in artifact creature decks, just because because those cards are two card types that get hit by Farewell a lot more, you can't choose both of those modes, artifacts or creatures, to make sure your stuff stays around, which is a little bit more difficult with Farewell. It's still a good card, and it's totally worth running, but it does make it not quite as synergistic, just because we are, when a lot of our stuff gets hit off of what we're using, we can only hit like graveyard and enchantments. It's not as good for the 6 mana that you're paying for. So I think right here, good enough. And again, I don't think you need a whole lot of board wipes. Most of the time anymore, I just see board wipes as a way to slow the game down. Unless they're like these board wipes, if it's just a straight up Blasphemous Act, or, a Wrath of God, where it just destroys all creatures. Symmetrical board wipes, I like less and less. Blasphemous Act isn't a bad one because it's more of a panic button for 1 mana. They just end up slowing the game down rather than actually giving you any extra board presence on top of anything else. For the most part, the games that last 3 hours for me are usually the ones that you see 4 or 5 board wipes resolve within that game from various players. So try not to slow the game down with our board wipes, but just allow us to sort of bring down our opponent's board while continuing to build ours up. So kind of just keeping that in mind with picking board wipes for decks like these. Card advantage, we have quite a lot of, we're in good colors for card advantage, but there's just a lot of good cards within, our archetype that also draw us cards. So I count Emry as a form of graveyard advantage, mostly just because she gives us access to playing cards from our graveyard, so we can kind of use that. And I've said this in previous videos, but the graveyard, when you're able to access it with like reanimation type spells, acts as sort of a second hand. And so, resilience is definitely a big part of that, where if someone destroys one of our artifacts or we have to mill them or whatever, through Emry is one of the abilities for that. We can just replay them over and over again. And of course, if you're running Emry as a commander, basing more around sacrifice stuff, you can sacrifice your artifacts, replay them over and over and over again. But just for this deck, I think it's just a good form of card advantage, another little way to get more access or to be able to reuse our artifacts over and over again. Insight Engine, one of the ones from the precon. This is definitely sort of based around the precon. We have a good amount of the precon cards, either because they're just good reprints that are artifacts, or more often than not, there's only so many charge counter cards or cards within this archetype that we're playing. So a lot of them are just either from this precon because they've made newer, better versions of those cards and within the archetype, or they're just the old ones that finally got a reprint. One of the newer ones, sort of an original design with Insight Engine, a pretty cool artifact. It's a 3 mana one that says tap, pay 2, and put a charge counter on this, and then you draw a card for each charge counter on it. So of course, the first time you do that, you get your 1 card draw. Not very good for 5 mana, but if you're able to proliferate that a few times with Kylo, being able to draw 3, 4, 5 cards off of 2 mana, getting that repeatable card draw engine is kind of the big thing with it's literally an engine. So kind of a good one there. That is definitely something to be careful with when you play this sort of deck. You want some of the lower costed stuff. Like I only have Ponder and Preordain as just our straight up card draw that doesn't have any sort of, they're just 1 mana without having to have any reduction or caring about any sort of synergy pieces. Because if you have too many that rely on having proliferate, like Insight Engine is really not a good card draw engine if you don't have Kylo out and you're not using this multiple times. It's a card engine that gets better over the turns, but the soonest you can use this card is like turn 4 or 5 with Kylo, and that's not a lot of good card draw for how long that takes. So having Ponder and Preordain are normal, just kind of good card draw that is non-conditional is still worth having, because even something like Thought Monitor is a good card draw engine, or Thought Cast, but they require you to have artifacts on the battlefield to reduce their costs, so you're not able to use them immediately in the way that you would want to. So they're kind of win more in a way, just because in times that you're still trying to rebuild a board, maybe after a board wipe, or you're just at the beginning of the game where you don't have the ability to pay for these, they're kind of dead. So you want to be sort of careful with that, just because you want to make sure that you can still draw cards, whether no matter what point in the game that you're at. I think Jeskai Ascendancy is a fairly good one for this. It's only 3 mana. It does a lot of different stuff for us, but what we mainly care about is whenever you cast a non-creature spell, so artifact spells, you draw a card, and if you do, discard a card. So kind of getting that loot effect, not straight up card advantage. You're netting the same amount of cards, though it's still allowing you to sort of sculpt your hand when you need to. Mindless Automaton, one of our actual synergy pieces within, not quite modular, but might as well be. It enters with 2+1/+1 counters on it, and you can remove 2+1/+1 counters from it to draw a card, or it also has an activated ability where you can pay 1, discard a card to put a counter on it. So it can fuel itself if you really want to, though of course the thing we want to do, I should just proliferate with Kylo a few times to be able to just remove counters for free to draw cards. That's really the thing with this. And then, of course, it's a creature that you might be able to hit with as well, because those are +1/+1 counters. It is just getting bigger as you do that. Though honestly, it's just kind of a basic card engine. I think that's also good as well. That's definitely another thing to think about with this deck, is the fact that a lot of our card draw is permanent based. Therefore, you're able to use them over and over again. You know, it's repeatable, which is kind of a big thing with that. It's really nice. Mystic Forge, just kind of another artifact staple. You may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may cast artifact spells and colorless spells from the top of your library, and you can pay 1 life to exile the top card of your library. So kind of a, I mean, you also have to tap. If you could just do pay 1 life to exile the top card of your library, that would be kind of a nuts card. But most of our deck is either going to be colorless spells anyway, and those colorless spells are normally going to be artifacts. So you're able to basically play most of the cards in your deck through this. So, you know, getting that extra card in your hand pretty much with the top card of your library being playable. That's also nice. And being able to, you know, get cards out of the way. You know, just the information of knowing what the top part of your library is nice for like shuffle effects, or even like knowing like a ponder. You're able to reorder or shuffle, or like preordering, being able to scry to the bottom if you're like, okay, I don't want this card, but maybe I can keep this on top to cast it off the top of my library, to draw the card. You know, there's a lot of different synergy pieces you can use with this, but just the information by itself would be kind of nice. Staff of Completion, this one does a whole lot of different things for our deck, and we care about most of them, though, you know, the card draw mode of this is being able to pay 4 life to draw a card, and then, of course, the cool thing with this is if you have some sort of infinite mana engine, you can just pay 5 to untap it. It's one of the, you know, staffs based on like Staff of Domination, you know, a very well-known infinite engine there. Though you do have to pay life for all of its abilities, so, you know, you're going to be draining yourself no matter what, though most of the time those abilities are worth paying the life for. The Might Stone and the Weak Stone has a bunch of different modes when it enters. Not only is it just, you know, a mana rock, but when it enters, you can choose to draw 2 cards off of that, which is kind of nice. Not only getting the 2 extra mana off of it, but also getting the card draw for 5 mana is, you know, a pretty good deal. Our first game changer here, the One Ring. Normally, this is one of the more expensive ones, and, you know, the One Ring is such an easy one to literally throw in any deck. It's just that good, you know. So I don't try to throw it in here because it's not really a good, I think, a good source of deck building when you just run staple after staple after staple. But for this deck very specifically, it has extra value, which is a big reason I'm running it, because the One Ring puts counters on itself that you can proliferate. So of course, the One Ring, when it enters, you gain protection from everything until your next turn, as long as you've cast it. It's indestructible, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life for each burden counter on it, but you can tap it, put a burden counter on it to draw a number of cards equal to the number of burden counters on it. So it is still sort of in a, you got to be careful with it, because of course the whole thing with the One Ring is the more cards you draw, the more damage you're taking, and so, you know, you got to kind of balance that out. So if you are proliferating this, you're also taking that much damage, so you got to be a little careful with that. You don't want to go just balls to the wall, I'm going to proliferate this an infinite number of times to draw a bunch of cards, because at a point you're either going to deck yourself, or, you know, you're going to just kill yourself at your upkeep because of how much damage it's doing. Though by itself, it's just a great card, even if you don't have the synergy. But because of the type of deck that we're running, that we care about proliferating counters, we can start making this draw. Like, even if you advance this 1 or 2 turns normally that you wouldn't, like, you're like, okay, I put it down, put a counter on it, draw a card, you know, before the next turn. I proliferate once or twice, so I'm drawing 3 or 4 cards, you know, a turn later. That by itself would be good enough. So it's just a great card, good in here, but I do like the extra synergy piece that kind of think excuses it for actually being in a deck rather than just being a really good staple to run. I already talked about some of these guys, just ways for us to draw cards, either off the ATB or just the card draw, and then the affinity of artifacts, reducing the cost of the spell by 1 for each artifact we control. So that's another thing that we have a lot of synergy around, just because a lot of these sort of affinity spells are expensive. Sometimes the mana cost can matter, though being able to reduce that, you know, paying 1 mana to draw 2 cards off of either of these is a very good rate. Down here, we've got one of the other precon cards with Uthros Researchcraft. It's a 3-mana spacecraft that you can station. So station is an ability where you can tap creatures to put a number of charge counters on this equal to its power. And you can only activate as a sorcery. It's not as good as crew, just because I don't think it needs to be. It's already a fairly okay mechanic. You know, I very much think that spacecraft and just the station mechanic is built for Commander specifically, just because we're slow enough that it actually matters. You know, I think most 60-card 1v1 formats, it's just too slow to really matter. Though if once you get it to 3 counters, you get to, whenever you cast an artifact spell, draw a card and you put a counter on it. So that's kind of a nice thing with this for being a spacecraft. And I think the only good ones really are the ones that are able to put counters on themselves through this. Of course, another thing with Station, you're putting charge counters on things, so the proliferate effect is definitely a big part of that as well. So we're able to ramp that up a lot faster. So, you know, spacecrafts are more worthwhile in this deck. Though with that, being able to also give itself those counters is really nice, and not just having the one ultimate ability, you know, at 3 counters, which is very easy to get to. You know, you could do that, you know, just station it straight up with Kylo, immediately get that online. And then also, you know, once you get to 12, it gets +1/+0 put for each artifact you control, and it becomes a flyer to 0/8. So it becomes also a big beater at the very end. Though mostly, you know, being able to draw cards whenever we cast artifact spells is a pretty good thing to immediately be able to turn on. So that's kind of the main thing card draw wise there. And then Voyage Home, another artifact, affinity for artifact spell. It's 5 mana and a white and a blue, so 7, but you can usually reduce it to the 2 mana pretty easily. You draw 3 cards to gain 3 life, so 2 mana, draw 3. Fairly good rate for what it is, not too bad. And then we got our boy Manican on there. But yeah, kind of just a good group of repeatable card draw for the most part. Some, you know, partial card draw, or just, you know, massive amounts of card draw. I don't think you need a whole lot of card draw in this deck, just because a lot of what our stuff does, they just kind of end up drawing you cards. You know, we're in blue, so we have a lot of the efficient stuff. You could run brainstorms and that sort of thing, you know, the regular cantrippy sort of card draw if you want to, though I think for the most part we have so many good options that it's not super necessary. So we do have a few cards that just generally care about having counters on them in some sort of way. These aren't all the cards in the deck, of course, that care about having counters on them. These are just the ones that kind of a general consensus don't do anything like, they don't draw us cards or make us mana or whatever. They just kind of, you know, put +1/+1 counters on themselves, or have charge counters or whatever, sort of just generally, or put counters on stuff. I think All Will Be One is a really fun one for this. Whenever you put 1 or more counters on a permanent player, it does that much damage to target opponent, creature opponent controls, or a planeswalker opponent controls. So pretty much any target. I don't think battles they specifically excluded for whatever reason. So whenever we're putting counters on stuff through, you know, our proliferate, if you've got 3 or 4 things that can proliferate to put counters on themselves, you know, you're dealing that much damage to whatever target as you divide it as you choose among any number of things. So that's really nice. This is sort of just a good sort of end game engine where you're like, okay, I can proliferate a whole bunch in this turn. Okay, I'm going to be able to use that for multiple, you know, points of damage, you know, ping stuff, whatever. So I kind of like that as just sort of an outlet for that, sort of our burn thing. Core Tapper. So this is sort of just a support piece for our charge counters. It's just a mirror. You can tap it to put a charge counter on target artifact, or you can sacrifice it to put 2 charge counters on target artifact. So, you know, if it has haste, or, you know, it doesn't have summoning sickness, you can tap it and then sack it to put 3 counters on something, which can be kind of nice. Again, there's not a whole lot of charge counter specific stuff in the deck, just because it's only so good, honestly. I think +1/+1 counters is a way more efficient thing to kind of focus on. Spacecraft is definitely one I think helps out a lot if you want to go more towards just straight up charge counters, but I think just kind of general counter stuff with this, and kind of just trying to get the best of all of the worlds, is more worthwhile and just a more powerful effect. You might as well just kind of take, you know, pick and choose what you want. You know, that's kind of the best part about Commanders, kind of being like, okay, I have access to all these cards. What are the best ones I can put into a deck to sort of, you know, get these weird archetypes that still are fairly strong. And I think Core Tapper is one of those that's just a good way to put counters on things, even if you aren't really, you know, it doesn't really matter if that artifact cares about charge counters. If you have something like All Will Be One out, there are a few things in the deck that do still care about charge counters. Like I said, spacecraft, if you want to, you know, kind of go more towards that and want to put more spacecrafts in here, I think that's another thing you can do that is more worthwhile with these sort of charge counter type things. Filigree Vector, I'm not actually from the precon. I'm surprised they didn't throw it in here. Kind of gotten expensive, I'm pretty sure, with the release of Edge of Eternities. It's 4 mana, a Phyrexian Construct. When it enters, you put a +1/+1 counter on each of any number of target creatures, and a charge counter on each of any number of target artifacts. So what you can do with this is, if you have artifact creatures, the way this is worded, you can put a +1/+1 counter and a charge counter on artifact creatures. You can target them twice with this effect, though, you know, if they're not, you can do one or the other. I like Filigree Vector just for that effect, because by itself, it just allows you to start the engine. So that's the sort of hard thing with Proliferate, is if you don't have any counters to start with, you know, there's nothing to proliferate. You can't put anything on top of that. So Filigree Vector just gives us a good way to start the counters to start proliferating that. And of course, putting counters on everything, even stuff that does, you know, put it on your Arcane Signet for a charge counter or whatever. If you got like an All Will Be One, that just becomes, you know, I think this is a pretty good combo of cards, just putting a bunch of counters on stuff so you can proliferate that and kind of get a whole bunch of value off of that. And of course, Filigree Vector itself, I think the other reason why it's really expensive, you can pay 1, tap it to sacrifice another artifact and proliferate as well. So it kind of feels its own ability, which is nice on top of that. Kappa Cannoneer, just generally a really good artifact creature, one of the better ones, legacy playable for how insane it is. So for one, it's got improvise, so you can tap artifacts to help pay for the mana cost. We kind of already talked about that before. That's really nice for Kylo because it's, a way to tap it without attacking. Get this down to 1 or 2 mana, pretty easily. It's got Ward 4, which is kind of the most nuts part about the card, honestly, besides, the last effect. It's really hard to deal with. Ward 4 is basically hexproof in most situations. Most people can't or won't pay that amount of, tax on something, especially in Commander. People hate paying taxes. So that's a really nice protection effect for itself. And it says whenever this or another artifact creature you control enters, or artifact in general, not a creature, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature, it can't be blocked this turn. So not only does it, get the counters that we can proliferate, it triggers itself to give it unblockable as soon as it comes down. So if you have haste or lightning greaves or whatever you can immediately attack with, it starts out as a 4/4 and just gets bigger and bigger and bigger when anything enters. So by itself, it's getting a bunch of counters. The proliferate can just increase that exponentially, and then whenever that happens, it's just giving itself unblockable to be able to swing out at someone. This card is just kind of nuts. It does all the stuff that we want it to do, and I think in the end game is a very good sort of okay, I'm gonna hit you for 20 and kind of take you out of the game. So that's really nice there. Power Conduit, sort of just another support piece. Though I like with this, you can do charge counters or +1/+1 counters. So you can tap it, remove a counter from target permanent you control, choose one, put a charge counter on target artifact, or put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So of course, you can pick and choose. I do like the ability to not just have like Core Tapper can only put charge counters. Power Conduit at the very least can also let you put the +1/+1 counter, which matters a little bit more for what we're doing. We got Steel Overseer. It just taps to put a +1/+1 counter on each artifact creature you control, so that's just another good thing that we can put more counters on stuff. Even if our stuff is only getting charge counters, put it on Core Tapper just because +1/+1 counters at the very least always do something, because it just pumps our creatures even if we can't remove them for whatever abilities. So we can kind of just pump our board over and over and over again. And of course, Steel Overseer with All Will Be One or something like that, you're getting a whole lot of damage on top of that as well. Threefold Thunder Hulk I really like in this deck because it is kind of an insane one. I put this in so many decks, but I think there's just so many cool synergies you can use with it. So it's a 7-mana artifact creature, which is definitely steep, though it has a great effect. It says it enters with 3 +1/+1 counters on it, and whenever this creature enters or attacks, you create a number of 1/1 colorless gnome artifact creature tokens equal to its power. And you can pay 2 to sacrifice another artifact to put a +1/+1 counter on it. So this is great. It's one of, sort of a Titan, like a Grave Titan sort of effect, where it has an enter and an attack trigger. Just by itself, it enters. It's a 3/3 and great 3/3s. Though if you have a Steel Overseer, or just with Kylo in general, being able to proliferate a few times with this, make it a 5/5, 6/6, 7/7. You're attacking with the giant creature, and then you're making that many 1/1s on top of that. And of course, with all of those, 1/1s you're creating, getting something out that can put a bunch of counters on your whole board, like a filigree vector, just making that even better on top of that. And it is also sacrifice ally to put its own counters on it. So whenever you're attacking with that, or when it enters, you can just pour mana into this if you want to. Sacrifice those gnomes to attack more, to make more gnomes. I think it's just a really fun card, a really good sort of game ender. Builds you a good amount of board, and 1 or 2 turns swinging with this, you're going to end up usually taking someone out of the game with just how much power it ends up generating. How much go wide ability as well. How many blockers it even gives you is kind of nice. So it's kind of that attack and defense, which I'm always a fan of. But I just think in general, kind of a good support piece. And lastly, here we have Walking Ballista. So for this deck, there's no, we're just running this as sort of a good +1/+1 counter proliferate a target. There's no real, there are combos in the deck, but funnily enough, they don't revolve around Walking Ballista. Ballista can be a support piece for those combos later on, but this one is just generally a good card. So it's got XX for its mana cost, and it enters with X +1/+1 counter. So if you put 2 mana into this, it enters with 1 counter. For its 2 counters, so on. You just divide whatever mana by 2. You can pay 4 mana to put a +1/+1 counter on it, or you can remove a +1/+1 counter to have it deal 1 damage to any target. And that's really the cool thing with this, proliferating instead of paying that 4 mana, way easier to do, and way more cost efficient. With like Kylo or something, just put a bunch of counters on it. Not only is it a big creature, again, that's just kind of a nice thing to have, but you can move those counters to ping stuff down, either kill a bunch of tokens, if someone's got a pesky skew swarm, you want to kind of nip that in the bud, or like plant tokens with like a Avenger Zendikar, or anything, getting enough counters on this to sort of just shoot stuff down, or even opponents if you really wanted to, kind of get rid of their stuff there, or, maybe if someone runs a battle, or planeswalkers, that sort of thing. You have a lot of variation with this, which I think is kind of fun, kind of that toolbox sort of thing with it. And of course, it's just a good card if you wanted to. Very easy to put a bunch of combos in here that, do a whole lot of stuff with that commander as well. But just in here, I think it's nice to have some of these cards as just sort of extra support pieces. And for interaction, kind of already talked about Walking Ballista and All Will Be One can just target anything. So I think those are good forms of interaction, just being able to ping off whatever we want. We've talked about the Might Stone and the Weak Stone, but one of its other modes is you can choose to give a target creature -5/-5 till end of turn, so you can dismember something when it enters. So that, -5/-5 kills most creatures anymore as well. Got a Chaos Warp, we got our counter spell, got our, our mini versions of Swords to Plowshares. Dispatch is a fun one because we are in, we're an artifact deck, so we have Metalcraft most of the time. It's just, a Swords to Plowshares that, normally it can just tap a creature, which is not super great, but if you have Metalcraft, you control 3 or more artifacts, it just exiles that creature with no upside for the opponent, so it's just kind of a better Swords to Plowshares most of the time. So that's kind of nice, Chaos Warp and Generous of sort of being our catch-all for permanents, just getting rid of anything we need to. Ripple's Potential is kind of fun. It allows you to proliferate, and then you choose any number of permanents you control that had counters put on them this way, and those permanents face out. So sort of a baby's first Teferi's Protection, which is kind of nice. And it just got a reprint here, so it finally dropped in price, which is really cool. And, the Proliferate can also be sort of a nice effect on top of that, but just the 2-mana to be able to phase out a bunch of our stuff is really nice. And because we are in both blue and white, we have Dovin's Veto, just be able to counter any creature spell and, have it be uncounterable is really nice. Not a whole lot of crazy interaction in here. I just don't have a super interaction heavy meta personally, so I only need so many pieces, though you definitely can wrap this up. Honestly, like even blue, you have your Pongify, you have all of your good, rapid hybridization, reality shift. You have a ton of good target removal. We've already talked about board wipes. We have access to, honestly, I think Jeskai has one of the better suites of removal, so you could add more in here if you wanted to, or make it more efficient and whatever you wanted. Kind of an easy one to do that for. For lands, we do have a whole lot of different lands, mostly because they're pretty easy to get anymore, pretty inexpensive, like, having our Tangle lands be really inexpensive, even, our filter lands are finally under $1. I remember when these were like $10 with like the release of Double Masters. It was insane. So we got a lot of cheap lands and a lot of just good lands in general. We have a few of these planet lands. So we have Adaja, which is kind of fun. Again, it's just kind of a one you can station. Once it gets to 12 counters, it has some sort of activated ability. So Adaja is kind of fun because it has pay for, tap, create a token that's a copy of target artifact or enchantment you control, except it's legendary. So if you want an extra copy of your Threefold Thunderhulk or whatever, this is a good way to just repeatedly do that, which is kind of nice. Just get a bunch of token copies of your best creatures. Academy Ruins, we can pay 2, 1 in a blue to put target artifact card from your graveyard on top of your library. So just kind of another way to sort of reanimate with that. Pain lands, and we got our artifact lands. Artifact lands are nice for like affinity type stuff. So just being able to reduce that cost, or, with a few of the different Metalcraft effects we might have in the deck. These are kind of just nice to run, just to have that extra artifact typing, or if you have to sacrifice an artifact or you care about artifact count in any sort of way, you might as well run these just because they're worth having that extra type on them. Archwave Innovation, it's a way to give the next spell we cast Improvise by paying a blue and tapping it. So, that's another way to either tap our commander or just reduce the cost. If we have a giant spell we want to cast that we don't, like a Threefold Thunderhulk, be like, okay, I don't have enough mana for this, but I have, a good amount of creatures and artifacts that I can tap for this to, reduce that cost and maybe cheat something out, sort of. That's kind of nice there. Buried Ruin, we can sack the land to return target artifact from our graveyard to our hand, so a little bit more animation on that side. Glimmer Void, so it's just a command tower pretty much. That's being the end step. If you control no artifacts, you sacrifice it, though most of the time we're going to be controlling one, so kind of just a free land add in here. Just gives us all our colors, and it's not crazy expensive either. Inventor's Fair, kind of nice, a way for us to tutor up an artifact if we have Metalcraft, which again is going to be a thing most of the time. So that's kind of nice. Gains its life at our upkeep doesn't really matter, but mostly the fact that we have a tutor in, on our land, that's pretty good to have. Right, Karn's Bastion, you can pay for mana to proliferate just in case, very inefficient, but the fact that it's on a land, you might as well get the extra utility out of that. Nesting Grounds, we can move counters around from one permanent to another permanent. So just in case like I said earlier, you need counters to start up, the proliferate effect. Okay, I'm going to be able to move, I have 4 counters on this Walking Ballista. I'm going to move one to another creature to start proliferating. Or even if you're like, okay, I want to be able to just proliferate more times and proliferate more individual permanents. You can be like, okay, I have a few charge counters on this specific artifact. I'm using Nesting Grounds to move that over to my Arcane Signet. You don't care about the charge counters on the Arcane Signet, though. Just being able to proliferate more stuff, with like an All Will Be one ends up mattering, can be sort of useful, even if those counters themselves don't actually do anything. Just sort of another thing you can kind of do on top of that. We got our Tangle lands, our brand new Tangle land, which is really, really cool. A few more artifact lands, and then Spire of Industry is just sort of our budget. City of Brass. Slow lands as well, they're just mostly inexpensive. I think the slow lands have gone up a little bit, but they're not all that bad. Like, this is, for as far as things go, I think this is a pretty inexpensive land base outside of, we have Uthros, which is a fairly expensive one, but not too bad. And I think, you get most of your mana fixing, which is another important part with this deck, because our commander is just 3 colored pips of different types. You want to make sure you have a lot of colors. You don't want to have too many basics. Like, we're only running a total of 6 in here, because we want to make sure we have a lot of different colors to be able to cast that on turn 3 when we get to that mana value. We had down here Uthros, really nice. I think it's the best, I think tied for the best when it comes to the Planet Land cycle, being just a Tolarian Academy. Of course, the Gaia's Cradle variant is also very, very good, but most of the time you can get out more artifacts a lot faster than you can, in terms of creatures, because we have like, artifact lands, that sort of thing, where we can kind of ramp that up fast. So, just kind of another good land by itself, easy to put down, easy to proliferate, so we can get to that even faster, and then, of course, giving us a whole bunch of mana sort of at that end game stage. Speaking of proliferate, we got like cards Bastion up here, but these are most of the other ones that proliferate. We've seen a few of these already, so Filigree Vector, of course, can, repeatedly proliferate. Ripple's Potential will proliferate for us. One of the most on Stuff of Completion, you can pay 3 life to proliferate, which I think is really the main reason you want to run this in the deck, just, another way to have that repeatable proliferation. Though, it has card draw on top of it, it has mana, making, kind of just all the modes of it make it worth running. We've got Metastatic Evangel. That's a really hard name to read, not really the best text on there. Just a 2-mana human cleric that whenever another non-token creature enters, we proliferate. We got quite a few creatures in the deck. Just getting that on top of, for 2 mana, getting that out really fast. Kind of just a nice thing to repeatedly get that effect. Dread Tie Whale. Whenever a player casts our second spell each turn, you proliferate. And it's got Vanishing too. So it's a 3-mana 7/5, which is crazy stats. And Vanishing, of course, it enters with 2 time counters, and once those counters go away, you remove 1 at each upkeep. It's like a Saga, except kind of in the reverse. Once it's out of time counters, you have to sacrifice it, but it can proliferate, so it can proliferate its own counters, which is, not really a drawback in this deck, because most of the time people are going to be casting at least 2 spells each turn, which means, even if one person out of the 4 that you're playing with ends up casting at least 2 spells, you're going to keep this around. It's not, it's going to be able to get at least a counter to remove the counter, and just having a counter on it to be able to proliferate by itself is kind of just a good thing to have. Though most of the time you're going to be getting, I think most of the time it's going to be all 4 turns. People are going to be casting at least 2 spells. So you're getting a whole lot of value off of this as well for the 3 mana it's worth. Tekuthal is also just a really nice one. Another just support piece. If you would proliferate, you instead proliferate twice. So all these effects become a whole lot better with Tekuthal, though of course just with the commander being able to tap it to proliferate twice. That's a really good effect. And sort of, or it's not really a proliferate card, but sort of just a turbo counter card with Deep Glow Skate. When it enters, you double the number of each kind of counter on any number of target permanents, which is also kind of cool, because it's just, hey, I've got 2 counters, 3 counters on this thing, I get to double that, and it's on each type of counter on each permanent. So if you've got an artifact that has both +1/+1 counters and charge counters, you get to double both of those rather than just picking one or the other. So this, I think, combined with an all-will-be one, can win you the game. Especially also if you decide to go the Super Friends route, this becomes insane, because most of the time, you have a Planeswalker enter, it's really hard to ultimate, though most of the time with most Planeswalkers, if you're able to double the number of loyalty counters they have, that gets to the ultimate. So kind of out of nowhere, you're able to put this down. Maybe you have a few Planeswalkers that just haven't been killed yet. You do this, you get your ultimates, and you kind of just win the game from that. But just in general, kind of a good acceleration engine for what we're doing. We're an artifact deck, so we have quite a lot of ramp at our disposal. There's a lot of cool ones that specifically interact with counters. So we got our staples here with like Arcane Signet, our Soul Ring, that sort of thing. We have cost reducers with like Enthusiastic Mechanaut and Ethereum Sculptor, Semblance Anvil. We can imprint stuff to have it reduced by 2, which is a pretty good effect. We are talking about Stuff of Completion. You can pay 2 life to add 1 mana of any color. We've got one of our other game changers in here is the Lord Artificer, for multiple reasons. For one, it taps artifacts, which, our commander's an artifact, so that's really nice to add blue mana. It creates an artifact when it enters, so we can just do that instant speed, which is really cool because it's Urza that is tapping the creature, it's not itself. We have other Urza in here, because, we're running the Mightstone and the Weakstone, you might as well run both. They're both good for this deck. Artifact instant sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less, so it gives us that cost reduction for multiple things, and of course you can meld it on the flip side if you want to. It does a whole bunch of different things. You can activate a whole bunch of different times. Though most of the time, just the front side of these are good enough to run. We've got Relic of Legends that, taps for mana, and we can tap untapped legendary creatures we control to add mana, which is also kind of a nice effect there. Grand Architect, we can tap untapped blue creatures we control to add 2 colorless spend to our mana pool. Spend that only to cast artifacts or activate abilities of artifacts, though most of the time that's what we're going to be doing anyway. Paradise Mantle is just a way to, it's a 0 cost artifact that we can equip it to something, and it just becomes a mana dork, which is really nice. Pentad Prism, it's got Sunburst, which is, sort of another interesting sort of way. And I don't really get the difference between Sunburst and Converge. Kind of a weird, I think the only difference here is the fact that Converge isn't an actual, because it's italicized, it's not an actual keyword. So Sunburst can be actually, on different cards can be, listed as something. You can have an effect that's like, oh, cards gain Sunburst as one of the artifacts that I've seen. So that's like an actual listed keyword that you can use, though they're the exact same thing. It enters with a number of card charge counters equal to the number of different colored mana to cast it. So if you spend a blue and a red to cast this, it gets 2 counters, and you can remove a charge counter from it to add 1 mana of any color. So that's nice, especially because it doesn't have to tap itself. So you can immediately, if you wanted to, remove the pay 2, remove the 2 counters. Not really good in that case. Though being able to just proliferate a few times with this, every time you proliferate, you're just getting mana for that, which is really, really nice on top of everything. Crystalline Crawler, it's a 4 mana one that when it enters, it's got the same thing. It gets +1/+1 counter for each colored mana spent to cast it. Though honestly, having the higher mana cost can be really nice because you're able to spend more types of mana on it. You can't spend 1 mana and get multiple colors out of that, even if you want to. And with a lot of this deck, we have stuff that not only adds our commander's color identity, which is already 3 colors, but Relic of Legends just taps for any color, so we can tap for a green or a black as well. So this could enter with 4 counters, and you can remove a counter as well and add 1 mana of any color, and it can also put +1/+1 counters on itself. So even if you aren't proliferating, this just gives you a bunch of mana. So I think in all ways this is sort of our best one here, just a way to get a whole bunch of mana all at once, kind of a ritual in and of itself. And just, if you're able to get all 4 colors of Converge, it's just going to be a straight up 1-to-1 mana outlet rather than being negative or positive, which that by itself can also just be nice. Pay this, even if you want to be able to double spell in that turn, pay that for 4, get all the colors, immediately remove the counters. You still have a 1/1 that can put counters on itself, so you're still netting something even if you do only pay the 4 mana and immediately remove those counters. So that's kind of cool as well. And like Everflowing Chalice, I think is another really fun one. You just see it played in decks. It's got multi-kicker 2, so it enters with an additional counter, charge counter for each 2 you've paid for this. So if you pay 2 mana, it's 1 counter, 4 it's 2, and then 6 it's 3. So usually just the 2 is good enough. I think that's kind of on rate. And then you can add a colorless for each charge counter on it, so it just gets better and better the more times you can proliferate. Again, just sort of all the synergy. But just in general, we have a good amount of ramp in here. You can add more, though I think, honestly, with the sort of thing we have, cost reducers are always nice because it's sort of like an infinite mana, because it's just a reduction. You never have to actually add that to your mana pool. So, adds for all of your spells, which is really cool. So you could, get 3 or 4 mana out of one of these effects in a turn. Or with like Semblance Amble, if you have, all these effects at once, you could just, plop down your whole hand for free, which sort of a non-bow with stuff like our Sunburst effects, just because you want to pay mana for them. Though most of the time, even if you don't, we have a bunch of other ways in the deck to be able to put counters on them, so it's not the biggest deal either. And then, of course, tappers and untappers is another huge part of the deck. So ways to be able to tap Kylo specifically, just because that's such a powerful effect for what we're doing. Being able to proliferate over and over again in a turn. If you're able to do that 2 or 3 times, you can usually, we've seen a lot of the cards that, can get value out of that, and it's a really, really powerful effect. So Arv Dominion is a really good one. It's a 2 mana enchantment. It says pay 1, tap an untapped creature you control to untap target enchanted creature. So basically what you can do is you can tap Kylo to untap itself for 1 mana. So of course, every time you pay that 1 mana, it taps and untaps, so you're just proliferating for 1 mana, which is a really, really good rate. Just a good mana seeker. Like, okay, I've got 3 or 4 mana, I'm just going to keep proliferating over and over and over again. Oh, now that I think about it, this by itself can also, if you've got something like a Pentad Prism or a Crystalline Crawler, you just got infinite mana. There you go. There's another combo I didn't even think about, but is very much in here. If you're able to just pay that 1 mana, proliferate, remove the counter, proliferate again, you just get infinite proliferate off of that. So there you go. There's another 3-card combo with either of those cards that allows you to just kind of keep doing that over and over and over again. So just more reason to want to run this card. Clock of Omens is just another good generic one that was really good for this deck specifically. You tap 2 untap untapped artifacts you control to untap a target artifact. So you could just keep tapping and untapping Kylo over and over again, tap itself to untap it, sort of like R of Dominion, though also with Clock of Omens, you have to tap an additional artifacts, so you're not netting stuff, though just being able to tap two things, tap two artifacts that aren't doing anything for you to untap, like your Soul Ring or something. Just make all of your stuff be able to tap for mana, like a sort of an Urza type effect. That by itself is kind of good enough. We've got Freed from the Real and Pemin's Aura as ways to pay a blue to untap target creature. This is sort of our actual combo for the deck. We've got Paradise Mantle, again, we've already talked about, just a way to make our commander tap for mana to be able to tap it. Relic of Legends allows us to tap our commander for mana. Grand Architect as well. Urza, kind of just a lot of mana dork type stuff is kind of the easiest way to make a lot of our stuff tap. We've also got like Manifold Key and Voltaic Key to untap our commander. So, just do that once or twice. Or, maybe you want to untap, something that adds extra mana if we want to, or like a Mightstone and Weakstone to kind of get ahead on mana. Though also Manifold Key can make target creature unblockable till end of turn, so that's like another sort of upside that's kind of nice. Jeskai Ascendancy, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, creatures you control get +1/+1 till end of turn. You untap them, so every time we're casting artifacts, you're getting multiple taps and untaps from that, so that's kind of nice. And then Unwinding Clock sort of at the end here just untaps all of our artifacts during each player's untap step, so sort of that Seedborn Muse effect, though. If you've got just Unwinding Clock and Urza on the battlefield, being able to tap your commander every single turn to proliferate on each round, that by itself, is a fairly good effect as well. Then at the end here, we have our value. So just generically good cards that are nice for the deck. We've got our last Game Changer here with the Enlightened Tutor. Kind of just a free slot. I might as well throw that in here, sort of a way to get what we want out. Search your library for an artifact or enchantment card, put on the top, and then shuffle. Or shuffle, then put that card on top. Rather, just an easy tutor to throw in here if you need your specific pieces for, if you want to go for the combo, adding more of these tutors, gamble, that sort of thing. Worthwhile if you want to, make this higher power, go towards more bracket 4. Sort of game enders here with Cyberdrive Awakener and Depth Shaker Titan. So Depth Shaker Titan is from this precon. It's a 7 mana 5/5. Whenever it enters, any number of target non-creature artifacts you control become 3/3 artifact creatures. Sacrifice them into the next end step, which is something that's kind of nice to have. The animation is not really a huge deal with this card. Honestly, the bottom text is what we care about more. It gives artifact creatures we control have melee, trample, and haste. And melee, of course, is whenever it attacks, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. So, that's kind of nice with proliferate stuff. But the trample and haste, really, that's kind of the best part there. Giving like our little gnomes a way to be able to attack and immediately, have a lot of overrun power. Cyberdrive Awakener is a very similar one. It gives other artifact creatures we control have flying. So that's even better a lot of times than trample, just because a lot of people don't have flyers. And when it enters, each non-creature artifact you control becomes a 4/4 artifact creature till end of turn. So they become bigger than with Depth Shaker Titan, and they also are, they don't have to be sacrificed at the end of turn. So a lot of times this can even be a better card, though running both of them is just two ways to be like, okay, we have a fairly decent board out here, or, we have a lot of artifacts that, aren't very usable, like an Arcane Sin or Soul Ring. It's like, this is just kind of sitting around, be able to, just kind of animate a board, immediately swing in for lethal. Having these sort of things that's sort of game ending is nice outside of like a combo, of course. Fabricate, just another way to tutor an artifact to our hand. Again, just sort of a good include, might as well. Word of Invention is nice because it's got improvise and it's instant speed that tutors to a battlefield. So we're like, okay, right now I really need to get a board out. I'm going to, tap a bunch of stuff to tutor out of Cyberdrive Awakener or something like that. Or like our Phyrexian Metamorph, being able to tutor that out to copy whatever we need. It's like, okay, I need a board or I need something to block with. I'm going to, hold this up until I can get this out and then immediately, get a lot of value off of that. I like the instant speed on this a lot. Even though it's, a more expensive version of the card, being able to immediately cheat that out as well is another huge effect with that. And then Liberator, just giving our color spells and artifact spells flash. Another thing that's just, it's nice to have the ability to have instant speed on everything, because it allows you to be more reactive in the way that you play and kind of keep stuff up until the last second to be able to play with them. And of course, whenever you cast a spell, if it's the mana spent on that spell was more than its power, it's a +1/+1 counter. So it also cares about the proliferate effect. So both sides of that is just kind of really good for our deck. And lastly, we've kind of talked about all the different parts of the deck. We've got the main combo here with one of these cards. So mainly, we've already talked about there's another combo in here as well with just the mana artifacts and being able to use our R of Dominion if you've got this out and you've got either Crystalline Crawler or Pented Prism to just be able to, keep proliferating forever. You need, of course, that's another thing with this deck why I think it's more of a bracket 3 combo, even though, it's a 3-card combo, is the fact that just proliferating by itself isn't good enough. You can proliferate and that's, that infinite ability is nice, but if you don't have anything to proliferate that matters, you're just proliferating to do nothing. It doesn't actually have any sort of outlet for that. So that's why it's more of a 4-card combo most of the time, just because you need to, have some sort of outlet as well. But for the combo, we need Kylo, of course, as the main piece here. You have some way to tap your commander and some way to untap it. So you either have Free from the Real or Pemenzar on the card, and then you have, one of our mana outlets to tap. So Paradise Mantle, Relic of Legends, and Urza allows us to tap our commander for mana, and then we can pay 1 blue, so tap it for a blue, and then pay 1 blue to untap the enchanted creature. So you're not netting anything with this, but you're able to tap it, untap it over and over and over again forever, and then you're just getting infinite proliferate effects. So for almost anything, if you've got one thing that has a counter on it, that's usually good enough. Like an all will be 1 trigger is good enough for that. Again, having infinite mana off of that, if you've got one of these out, that can be really nice. Charged counters with anything, being able to put a bunch of counters on Dreamtide, well, kind of doesn't really matter, just keeps it around forever. But if you got like Walking Ballista is usually like the outlet, of course. Just getting a bunch of counters on that, just making it as big as possible. Anything with +1/+1 counters, you can just make infinitely big. Getting an infinitely big usable Cap Cannoneer, putting infinite number of counters on stuff like Overseer, getting infinitely big 3-fold Thunderhawk, I think is one of the cooler ones, because immediately attack and make an infinite number of dudes, and then you kind of just winning through that. But I think Walking Ballista is the most clean kill, because it's just, hey, I deal 1 damage to everything forever, and then you all die. So yeah, that's kind of our game-ending combo there. So again, the Commander's just one of those where it's easy to stumble into combos. You might even find more on top of that. I found one just by recording this video. But there's a lot of different ways that you can do that, and a lot of ability here to really synergize. We're not super heavy on, charge counters and just counter stuff in this deck, just because, I think there's a lot of other stuff you can do. Though, again, with this commander, there's a lot of different archetypes you can build into. So, if you don't like this specific build, I think you can take a lot of the bones and structure of this deck and make it more of a spacecraft deck or a vehicle deck, or, make it, Super Friends. You can pick your counter that you want to do with, or even if you wanted to, there are a few cards within this, color pie that you could do Infect or that sort of thing, or -1/-1 counters or something. There's a lot of different abilities that you can go with, and a lot of different avenues, which is what I really like with this commander. Same thing with Hearthrow. Just both being able to allow us to take the path we want to. That's another thing with a lot of these pre-con commanders, is the ability to kind of build the way you want to, and I like that ability, and I like how Wizards is kind of giving you the choice to kind of pick your avenue. There's a lot of different cards in the deck that go a lot of different directions, so kind of honing that in, picking your direction, kind of gives you that creative outlet. But yeah, that is the deck list review. I hope all of you have enjoyed this. If you want to take a look at the deck list in its entirety, I will leave a link to the Mox field in the description below. And if you want to check out any of the other deck list reviews I've done, I will also leave a link to that YouTube playlist in the description. Besides all of that, I will see all of you beautiful people in the next one.